Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix. This is Micronation, Chapter 9. A New Employer. It was my last day in prison. I had done my time, and I was relieved that they were indeed going to let me go. I was going to be on probation, just like any other prisoner, but it was a welcome surprise. There had been a time when Quiescence's extended sentence due to his numerous escape attempts would have delighted me. Now I just felt pity as I looked upon the vacant, socket-eyed man who had once been the most indomitable spirit I'd ever known. I was beyond him. Icarus had been burned, downed, crushed, cut, melted, gutted, stuffed, mounted, and put on display for all the world to see for what a fool he was. Chester Arthurson was triumphant. There was no Watson anymore. I grabbed the last of my things, carefully crammed into my single duffel bag, and walked with the guard towards the exit. We were stopped at the security checkpoint when a high-ranking military officer came through and whispered to the guard escorting me out. Then he motioned for us to follow him as he went back into his cell. I wasn't sure what this was about, but I didn't like it. Prow hadn't shaved in weeks. He wasn't eating very much either. When we walked up to the cell, he didn't bother looking up to acknowledge our presence. "Quiescence Otter Prow," the general spoke. Prow didn't do anything. He just kept lying there. Prow's middle name was Otter? The guard had originally escorted me out, ran his club over the bars. This caused Prow's picture of Darla to drop off the shelf and shatter. Since this was a secret prison, visits of any kind were not permitted, nor were letters. However, somehow, the lawyers had gotten the divorce notice to Prow a year ago. They'd made him sign the papers. I wasn't interested in Darla anymore, but I'd heard that she'd received the bulk of Prow's considerable estate. Most people who ended up here lost everything. Fortunately, I had nothing to lose. The guard grabbed Prow's head and pointed it at the general, where Prow continued to refuse to speak. The general read a very official-looking piece of paper out loud, only occasionally glancing at Prow or myself as he did so. The wording was as follows. "Be it herewith noted that Chester Abner Arthurson and Quiescence Otter Prow are hereby pardoned for all crimes and misdemeanors against the populace of the United States in light of their considerable contributions to society. Their record shall henceforth be expunged of all mention of wrongdoing or criminal intent. Office of the President of the United States of America, President Martin J. Hamburger." Then, without another word, the general rolled up the paper and put it into his pocket. He saluted the two of us and walked away. The faint clicking of his jackboots echoed down the empty cell block. I'm not a political major, but I was fairly certain that presidential pardons do not normally expunge past records. Then again, the prison that we had been in was not exactly normal, or technically legal. What was I going to do, sue the government? This was probably the only federal prison in existence that was not a regular hobby of the inmates to randomly sue people in. The guard looked at Prow. "You need to pack your things." Prow refused to move. The guard bent down and yelled in his face, "You need to pack your things!" Prow still refused to move. At first I thought Prow had somehow escaped and left a hologram in his place or something, but the guard punched him in the stomach and Prow doubled over in pain. Prow finally spoke. "I don't want to go. There's nothing you can do to make me." The guard punched Prow in the stomach again. There are easier ways to move him, I imagine, but they had grown tired of Prow. Prow groaned, but didn't move. "Look, idiot, I don't care if you don't have anything out there. You can't stay here." He reached for his radio and spoke on his shoulder. Into the radio. "Charlie, get a box. We're going to have to pack for a prisoner." "Huh?" Came a confused reply on the other side. "Just bring a box." A short time later, the two guards proceeded to cram all of Prow's remaining earthly possessions into a small cardboard box. It was even smaller than my own. Each guard grabbed Prow by an arm and dragged him through each checkpoint while I followed behind. Normally, there was all kinds of processing that one had to go through on the way out. I had already been briefed on it. But with the pardons, we skipped all of that and headed right outside to the main gates, where they thrust Prow indignantly onto the curb of the sidelock, where he was crumpled in a heap. This is the part of the story where I'm supposed to feel sorry for Quiescence Prow. Yeah, I know, I said earlier that I did. That was a short-term thing, not a long-term thing. This is the part where I realized that he had learned his lesson and that he was a fellow human being. I had done my time. Never mind that fate had cruelly linked me with this idiot. I suppose there would have been some kind of criminal liability to just leave him to die like that. Then again, we're outside of a top-secret government facility, and I'd been gone for nearly 5 years. Who was going to know? I turned around. The prison was gone. There was nothing there but an empty desert. How did they do that? Was the whole thing underground? I'd been outside many times, and it had never felt like a desert. I started to walk away. I got about 200 feet and then stopped. I found a lump under my right armpit. I'd found a lump under my right armpit 2 weeks ago. Turned out it was only from changing deodorants, yet I couldn't help but wonder at the time. Ever since Prow had got me into the vicious habit of writing, my life and other people's lives, I was more than just a tech writer. I saw my life as a story. I saw everyone's life as a story. It disgusted me. Life certainly wasn't Hollywood, but at least I had to wonder how I would look to someone else. Don't get me wrong. By now, I am writing for my own satisfaction and sanity, but Prow's not Prow's whimsical vanity. No one will ever find these pages, but I still had to write them. The funny thing is, looking at death, even though that lump had turned out to be nothing more than an allergic reaction, it made me feel my own mortality. I was going to die. I'd never really believed in God. I wasn't an atheist. I suppose I'd never really thought about it before. The world was too cruel and unequal to have any sort of merciful God at the helm, no matter what the elaborate justifications or sophisticated arguments the apologists made. And yet, I still knew who I was. I knew that I had no truly redeemable qualities whatsoever. I had judged many people in my time, Quiescence Prow among them, yet, despite my supposed reform in prison, I was willing to let a man drown in his misery and die in the desert. And make no mistake, I knew the prison I had been in, and I knew Prow's stubbornness. I could leave, but I could not in any way leave without the sure knowledge that Quiescence Prow would die. I sighed with exasperation and turned around to walk back. I might not have too many honorable qualities, but at least I wasn't going to let Prow die, no matter how much the wiser part of me knew that it was the right thing to do. As I turned, I saw that the choice had been made for me. A slick silver Rolls-Royce had driven up. A driver, and a large, strong man in a business suit, was helping Prow into the car. Apparently, Prow had found his luck yet again. Good. Ethical dilemma solved. I turned around and started to walk away again. I had no curiosity about Prow's fate whatsoever. He would come out of this smelling like roses. He always did. I got about a half a mile when I heard the limo behind me. I could hear the Jaws theme playing in my head. What if Prow had seen me turn my back on him? What if he had constructed this as some kind of elaborate measure of goodwill on my part? What if he thought I liked him? The idea was so nauseating that I actually bent down and relieved my cookies under the nearby grass in a ditch. I heard the sound of the electric window roll down. I got up and kept on walking. "Hello, Chester." The voice belonged to Darla Prow. I was surprised to hear it and turned my head. Maybe she'd gotten some points in my book when she divorced Prow. Maybe I still felt like, maybe I was still an idiot and attracted to her on some level. Darla wasn't actually there. A large man in a suit held up a small screen a few inches wide with Darla's picture on it. I kept walking, but I answered, "Hello, Darla. Want a lift?" "No, thanks. I want to hire you." I could tell the idea thrilled her. "Really?" "No, thanks." "I'm not keen on it either, but you're Quiescence's magic feather. He thinks he needs you, and we need him." Darla's picture frowned. "Who is we?" "My husband and I. I thought you divorced Prow." I kicked some sand as I walked. The duffel bag was heavy. "I did." "Oh? Who's the new husband?" "I'm not at liberty to say unless you join us." I laughed and kept walking. I heard Darla sigh and the window started to go up. Then Prow spoke. "Wait." Then the window stopped. You agreed to work with me, Chester, Prow said. "Did I? 3 years ago." I couldn't believe it. I remembered my foolish promise. You said you were going to get me out with a presidential pardon. You did get a presidential pardon, Prow said with a hint of smugness. And you were responsible for it? There was a pause. No, but the method was never a condition. Logically, I should have told him no. Unfortunately, I was in a moment of weakness, and I was considering what kind of person I chose to be, and figured being honorable and keeping your word were among the qualities I wanted to have. But I was an idiot. All right, Prow, you win. One case. That was the agreement. We find the conspiracy, and then I'm done. The door opened, and I got in. The air conditioner felt very nice. Darla spoke on the screen. If that's the case, you're going to have a very short time here, Chester, since the conspiracy is us. I looked at Darla. She looked serious. I said, okay, so what's up with the time viewer, or the weird dancer people? She smiled. I wasn't in the conspiracy at that time, and in many ways, this one doesn't exist yet. Prow coughed and said, this one? As near as we can tell, there are 4 or 5 conspiracies that really matter. We're the good guys. Of course, I said reflexively. Darla frowned. I had forgotten your charming wit, Chester. I hadn't forgotten yours, Darla. I hadn't forgotten yours. And so it was that after some time of deliberation, I was once again sucked into the oddly annoying world of Quiescence Prow. As I sat in the limo, I idly wondered just what it was I would ask of Prow. Since he had no more money left, I could hardly ask that of him. And since he'd already enjoyed enough suffering on his part to last a lifetime, I didn't need that either. In fact, I really didn't owe him anything, since Prow hadn't actually arranged to get me out. As the desert moved by, I couldn't help but consider that it might still be attraction to Darla that motivated me. This was stupid. She hated me. I hated her. True. She seemed to no longer be Prow's creature, but she also had remarried some mysterious figure we're now supposed to be working for. As we pulled into the airport, we both saw that what had clearly been Prow's jet waiting for us. Instead of Prow's name stenciled on the side, it had a large graphic image of a sun and a moon in zenith over the earth. It might have been an eclipse, but I didn't think so. It was primed, fueled, and ready to go. As I walked up the steps behind Prow, his increasing confidence and animation dimmed somewhat. He had a look of shocked sadness on his face. I guess it was one thing to enter a depressed stupor. It was quite another to have to deal with the actual reality that your world had been shattered. Such was the nature of reality. The plane took off and headed west at a very rapid pace. In a short while, we were over the ocean. I had no sense of navigation whatsoever, so I just relaxed and enjoyed my freedom. And it was freedom. Even if I was returning to familiar haunts, I was free from emotional bondage that had previously held me captive. After 2 hours, Prow came and sat across from me. He had taken advantage of the jet to shave and clean up a bit, but he still smelled. The jet had no shower facilities. He began to speak. Watson, Chester, I might be free, but I was no one's sidekick. Fine, Chester. Does this whole situation bother you? I suppose, I said. Though you will have to be a little bit more specific about what you mean by bother me. After all, Prow's poverty didn't bother me in the least. I mean, the fact that the very conspiracy that locked you up is now employing you. Which conspiracy would that be? We're unlikely to ever really know what's going on. Who can be everywhere at once like that? Prow smiled. Aha! I had asked myself that very same question, and I think I have an answer. Do you remember the time viewer from my very first case? I didn't like where this was going. Yeah? Prow nodded. Exactly, like he could read my mind. Anyone who can see in the past has tremendous power. We had thought it might be used for law enforcement, or to disrupt government secrecy, but it could just as easily be used for a secret conspiracy. You could tell who was loyal to your cause and who wasn't. You could blackmail anyone who ever tried to hide. Such a device has tremendous power in the wrong hands. I thought about it. He was right. If I could think of all the kinds of evil things to do with it in a few seconds, then someone with a more diabolic mind and greater access to resources could be truly frightening. Now you see why I felt that the world was threatened. But we can surely trust our new employers. Prow was looking around at random while talking. What are you doing? I asked. Nothing, Prow said. You're trying to look into the time viewer like it was a television camera, aren't you? No, I was just thinking how wonderful our new employers are. You know, they might not be looking into a time viewer. They might be bugging the jet. Prow looked around with increasing paranoia. You're right, of course. So, if they know your every action, then you're doomed. Prow put his knees up to his chin and huddled in a fetal position. He shivered and lay on his side. He actually started to suck his thumb. Between bouts of this, he murmured a quiet mantra, "Doomed, doomed." I give you quiescence, Prow, ladies and gentlemen, famed detective, ex-millionaire, sought after by beautiful women, government agencies, and apparently diabolical conspirators. I laughed. The jet flew several more hours. Eventually, Prow stopped acting like a complete clown and read a book someone had left on the plane. Sherlock Holmes, of course. I watched a few in-flight movies. I ate most of the food and drank most of the wine on the plane. I had a lot of time to make up for, and I must have gotten pretty smashed because I had a major headache when I woke up. The fashion seatbelt sign came on, and I looked out the window. I was utterly amazed. The complex beneath us was a man-made structure, more of an island, really. About half of it was a massive oil rig on concrete stilts. The other half looked almost like a normal island, but seemed to rest upon something rubbery. Couldn't quite make it out. There were hundreds of trees and dozens of buildings sprawled out before us. The runway slowly extended to one end of the complex and then floated, bobbing up and down on the ocean on the north side of the island. I wasn't entirely comfortable with how it moved up and down with the waves, but apparently the pilot was, because our landing was only slightly bumpier than any such ride I'd had before. The jet taxied up the runway, and I entered the island proper. When I got a closer look at it, I could see the bottom of the island was made of some kind of recycled tire material, mixed with an unusual gray plastic-like substance, while the top was covered by 4 or 5 feet of topsoil. There were a dozen men who grabbed our plane and pulled it towards the nearby waiting hangar. The frost coming from their breath told me that it had to be very cold. I noticed how I'd missed a plethora of smokestacks and industrial pipes. Apparently they had their own on-site refinery. This seemed particularly odd to me since I saw a dozen windmills pumping furiously from the wind. Indeed, as I looked farther out, I could see more such wind towers for several miles. Fascinating. The jet came to a complete stop, and the hangar door shut up behind us. As I looked out the window, I was again impressed by a large custom-designed gateway docking mechanism for the small jet, just like I would see in any major commercial airport. It connected to the jet with a loud click, and the door opened. The pressurized air of our cabin left with a slight hiss, and much to my surprise, the air on the island felt just as warm as it had in our cabin. We got out of the plane. The area on the other side was like many of the airports I'd flown in with Prow in North America. It even had a small restaurant and gift shop. For a brief moment, I couldn't help but wonder if there wasn't some generic airport equipment catalog that they ordered these chairs and windows from. Was there some kind of international airport equipment dealers convention? Worlds within worlds within worlds. Such is the nature of humanity. There were several people waiting for us when we arrived. Half of them were obviously high-level executive security guards with business suits and several Secret Service-style earpieces. Judging by the conspicuous bulges in their jackets, they were very well armed. 3 stood out the most. I only recognized Darla, and given her furtive glances in my direction, I made her very uncomfortable. Could this possibly explain the presence of so many armed guards? We were, after all, 2 ex-convicts. Prow clearly recognized one of the other 2 men, even though I didn't. "What?" Prow said boldly, with the tone of voice might use when warding off Dracula with a cross. "Is your name?" The man to whom Prow was speaking was largely featureless. He had a sandy blonde hair, brown eyes, and acted and dressed like most of the other cookie-cutter Harvard MBAs. "My name is Mitchell Ferret. I'm the CEO and Chief Managing Officer of this facility. This," he pointed to the other man I didn't know, "is Gerald Hickman. He is the head of security of the Lure complex." Gerald was tall, about 6'8", and pale. He was somewhat muscular, but looked more like a marathon runner than a boxer. I could tell that he was quite confident in himself and the way he looked. He looked to be in his late 40s and early 50s and wore a faded suit that said he hadn't bought a new one in nearly 2 decades. The platinum Rolex on his right hand, combined with his very expensive shoes, said that this was by choice, not forced circumstance. We got into an electric tram of some kind and entered a series of service tunnels. There were bustling with people of every kind and description. I could see that this small island represented a wide range of nationalities. Darla asked Prow, "So what do you think of our little slice of heaven?" There were a lot of emotions in that statement. Prow was much harder to read. His voice was full of hurt, anger, and disdain. It's very impressive. I counted at least 7 corporate insignia. Ferret replied, 28 in total, actually. Darla smiled and hugged Ferret possessively, and I thought defensively, yes, but only 5 matter. Ferret chuckled, they all matter. On paper, dear, only on paper. We stopped next to the elevator. Gerald spoke for the first time. I'm going to escort you both to your quarters so you can get refreshed and cleaned up when we're meeting later. Prow arched an eyebrow. What meeting? Ferret chuckled and cricked his neck. The one where we finally answer all the questions about what's been going on. I could tell from this statement that both Darla and Gerald were uncomfortable with the idea, but it was Gerald who answered, most of your questions, not all of them. Prow grunted in what I presumed was some kind of temporary resignation to this situation. Regardless, we followed Gerald up on the elevator and went up 9 floors. We bypassed the lobby and entered what looked like a hotel. Quarters can be somewhat luxurious for permanent guests, but a lot of the apartment buildings are still under construction. Once you decide whether or not to accept your position, you'll be assigned more permanent quarters. I couldn't help but ask. I know we're supposed to wait until the meeting, but I can't help but ask, what exactly do you want to hire us to do? Gerald smiled and said when he got back into the elevator, why, the same thing we do every night, Pinky. Try to take over the world. Your room is 508. Mr. Prow's is 510. Doors open by a palm scan. You will need to be contacted by phone when you'll be contacted by phone when we want to meet with you. Good day, gentlemen. The doors to the elevator closed and he went down. Prow practically hissed at me through his teeth. There, see? He has much admitted it. They're plotting to take over the world. Mr. Ferret, he's the one I told you about. The nameless master of memes. I can't believe Darla married him. Maybe she's gone underground as some kind of double agent, I said as we moved to our rooms. I put my hand on the palm reader and the door opened with a satisfying hiss. It was only a few moments later that I realized that Gerald's comments relegated me to sidekick status yet again. Prow said, we need to find out what they're up to and destroy it. Assuming we want to stop it. You agreed to help me, Prow sniffed. The weather here obviously wasn't good with him. I agreed to help you find out what's going on. Seems to me they're inclined to find out already. You don't think, Prow. You act and you feel. That pretty much sums up every problem you've ever had. Good night. See you later. I could tell Prow wanted to continue this conversation, but I shut the door. Anticipating Prow's reaction, I reached into my duffel bag, pulled out a small taser, and attached it to the doorknob. I went to lie down on the bed and relaxed. Sure enough, a short while later, Prow pounded on my door. A little while later, he tried to jiggle the knob. There was a brief jolt by a loud thud in the hall, preceded by a short whimper. I slept like an infant. I woke up 6 or 7 hours later and took a shower. It felt good to be clean again. I picked up the phone and ordered breakfast. Right now, I didn't want to know who was paying for it, but honestly, I didn't care. Several servings of eggs, bacon, and pancakes later, I looked at the TV. At first, I had trouble finding the remote, but then I found a piece of paper on the desk drawer next to the Gideon Bible that explained that the flat screen had a verbal interface. After a few moments of delighted exploration, I discovered over 9,000 channels, only half of which were in English. What pleased me most about this was the internet interface. I opened a new email account. It was one that I could send from as well, and I sent several emails at random. I even sent one to my second cousin, who I hadn't written in 6 or 7 years. I knew I'd been in prison too long when I was happy to get spam. I spent the better part of the day becoming human again, but soon enough, ordering food, receiving spam, and mindlessly watching television got old. I got a call from Gerald inviting me to a meeting at around 5, and I realized I had the best clothes in my duffel bag were really pretty shabby. I wasn't getting any younger. Since I had worked most of my life as a contractor, I'd never had anything of a 401k. Then again, to be honest, I'd never really trusted the stock market. It was too shaky. I was definitely not going to trust my fate to some Wall Street investor who would ravage my stock for his own personal gain. But I had to have something for retirement. Now we were surrounded by rich, powerful people who had not only flown me across the world, but who had secured a special presidential pardon to make it so that, according to their official record, I had not committed a crime in the first place. Darla hated my guts, but she saw the need in Prow's obsessive-compulsive world for me to help him. And for some reason, the idiots felt like they needed Chris and Prow. You know what? Who cares if Prow was a moron? I was going to get rich. Oh, I wasn't going to demand a really high salary. I'd take what they paid me and like it, but that didn't mean there was an opportunity here, and I intended to take advantage of it, somehow, some way. I showed up at the meeting in a polo shirt and Dockers. Everyone else was wearing suits or fancily dressed, including Prow. No, despite his eccentricity, Prow was not wearing a dress. Ferret, Prow, Darla, and Gerald were all there, along with a young Latin male with very dark hair and an older man in his late 60s or 70s. I felt very underdressed. Normally I didn't care about such things, but I was starting to. The table was immaculate, and they were dining on much nicer food than what I'd ordered back in the hotel room. I sat in the only empty chair. Ferret made the introductions, pointing to the young Latin male who said, This is Michael Onyx. He is my assistant chief of security. You will be working with him extensively. He pointed to the other older gentleman. This is Abraham Bell. He is... Ferret paused for a moment to consider what you might call the father of Fleur. What in the hell was Fleur? Abraham chuckled good-naturedly. Please, Mitchell, you do me too much credit. All I did was have a few ideas and fall flat on my face a few times. Ferret chuckled. I don't do you enough credit, my friend. Without you laying the groundwork, none of this would have been possible. Abraham actually blushed. Old cynical me would have found this sickening, and therefore found a reason not to trust the old coot. New greedy and entrepreneurial me realized this guy was rich, and that such habits were perfectly acceptable. There was some disagreement between the two, including a third quality called consciousness, who had a baseball bat with rusty nails in it, but I tuned him out and tuned them all in at this point. Prow tapped his glass like he was going to make a toast. Everyone raised their glasses, and Prow said, Have we reached the point of the evening where I can ask questions? Everyone put their glasses down a moment in awkward silence, but Ferret then nodded in reply. Yes, of course. Prowl leapt right in. Well, first, let's start with the obvious. How exactly are you planning on taking over the world? Gerald chuckled. Easy. We're not. Prowl looked smug. But you clearly said yesterday that was such your intention. Gerald's mouth hung open for a second time in as many minutes. That was a joke. Oh, Prowl said dejectedly. That state didn't last very long. Then what precisely is the purpose of your conspiracy? Ferret grinned. Well, if I may be so bold, it's about to save the world. Prowl snorted. Oh, please. Unspoken was the phrase. It's my job to save the world. You people are clearly villains in my delusional world. Ferret shrugged and continued to grin. He poured himself a glass of cognac. Seriously. Now, I admit we only plan to save it for a select group of people. People with money, Prow said with authority. Now that he was poor, he was clearly the unheralded champion of the proletariat. At first, yes. We're not running a charity here, but we want to help anyone who wants to work for it. Help them how? Ferret pointed up. Help them get out. Prow's brow furrowed. Space? This is about space? Abraham nodded. In a manner of speaking, this is really about liberty. Governments control every aspect of our lives. Where we eat, how we talk, what we teach in school, it's sickening. Prow said, governments do a great deal of good. Of course they do, Ferret replied. But too much of a good thing is really a problem. Space is really the last place where any sort of real freedom is possible. Prow sighed. All right, let's assume for a moment I believe you. Not that I do without research. Good luck with that without Darla, chum. But my next question is just as important. Prow sipped his brandy. Who exactly are the other conspiracies you mentioned? Ferret shrunk down in his chair. He wasn't nearly as enthusiastic about the subject. That's complicated. Conspiracy is an awfully neat and simple word. I like to think of it as grouping or club a little better. In some ways, you could call it one of a massive conspiracy, but it really just the same players in daylight, who use a different set of rules under the table. Abrams broke in. The first thing you need to understand is that the media is not what you think it is. While it's a tool of these conspiring men, almost never block or change a story in a ham-fisted way. Instead, they nudge it in a very consistent fashion across multiple channels to achieve the same effect they desire. That's where the memetics discovery you made came in so handy. About that, Prow started to say. Ferret raised a hand. One question at a time, please. Abraham is getting ahead of himself. There are 4 or 5, maybe 6 clubs in the conspiracy. These clubs are somewhat geographic, but they're also philosophical. The U.S. has its fascists and the communists, though they are really more neo-fascists and neo-communists. Both are heavily involved with corporations, since corporations are the best tool for their purposes. Gerald grumbled. They're the best tool, period. I would like to be IT. It would be like IT without computers. It can't be done in any sense that isn't laughable. Ferret chuckled. Be that as it may, the Russians and the Chinese definitely have their own. There are other smaller ones, but they're so national I would rather doubt you'd call them global. The Europeans and the Japanese are sort of clubs, but they waver between national conspiracies or into the other areas of the others. After all, sometimes China's club is more Asian and Russia's club is more organized crime. They tend to bleed into each other a lot. Prow nodded. Fair enough. This is an explanation I can believe. He seemed to be taking great delight in the fact that people were finally answering his question. All right, next question. Darla and you said only 5 companies actually mattered. Which are those? Ferret frowned. She might have said that, but we have 28 partners, and when you include the subcontractors, Darla interrupted him, putting her hand on Ferret's shoulder. Maybe I should answer this, dear, since he was asking the question because of what I said. I could tell the gesture of affection bothered Prow a great deal. He picked up one of the grapes from the tray of fruit on the table and put it in his mouth. He kept repeating this process to keep from saying anything he might regret later. Interesting. Darla continued when Ferret shrugged, smiled, leaned back in his chair and resignedly. There are many companies that have contributed to Hlur, but 5 of them represent over 95% of the stake in the complex. Furthermore, most of those companies my husband mentioned are just here to do business. The 5 that matter are the companies that have a vision beyond the next quarter's profits. They are the 5 that have an agenda, a seat on the board, and thus a potential conflict with one another. Prow nodded. And those are? Darla sighed and said, well, that's a long story. The company that got all this started was Troutlink. They've always been an alternative energy company. But 4 or 5 years ago, a man named Elgers Bakjon did an independent survey of this part of the Siberian coast to look for oil using a method he'd invented. The thing is, Bakjon had served time as a conman, so none of the other companies would take him seriously. Troutlink wasn't even in the oil business, but when their business manager saw the size of the field, he saw an opportunity. We're 25 miles off the coast of Russia. We're well beyond the international boundaries as recognized by the UN. The thing is, Russia's a bit of a kleptocracy. It's run by thugs who think that whatever they think they can get away with stealing. Darla took a deep breath and curled a lock of her hair. They saw it as particularly ironic since they use oil to get oil. So they contact other companies when they saw as responsible and beneficial. Flexiton is an IT company. They wanted to make Hlur an unlimited a limited data haven. There are limits on what they will tolerate, but the main thing is that they have removed their major assets from the other nations, which means they can put up web pages with content that might get them sued anywhere else. Calyptos is all about undersea water colonization. They see Hlur as the perfect model for that. Angelbright is Abraham's baby. They're all about space. Out here, they don't have to deal with FAA regulations to authorize flights. Finally, there's Doi. Wait, Hlur was an island? What was to keep it from getting invaded? I arched an eyebrow. Doi? They're a military contractor. Well, that's true, Darla said evasively, but a small one. And they do a lot more than that. They're actually acting as an umbrella contractor to bring all the subcontractors together. The other 24 or so. They're also handling our diplomacy. They've got companies from several nations to make sure they all think that they've got a stake in what's going on here. That keeps them off our backs for a while, at least. Prow sat and thought a long moment. Then he asked, how do Chester and I fit into all of this? Ferret said, we've got security, but we want someone to take it on the offensive. We're doing a lot of things that might threaten the natural order. And some people will not like that. We want someone with just the right combination of paranoia, intuition, and guile to proactively find anything that people might be doing to disrupt us before it happens. Still want the job? Why didn't they just use the time viewer, I thought to myself. Prow thought for a moment and then said, I'll take it. And just like that, we were in. I was surprised. I would have expected him to ask at least half a dozen more stupid or pointless questions. Instead, he asked mostly sane ones. I couldn't help noticing that no one had asked me anything, if I wanted to join at all. It was just assumed. They were right in that I wanted to join, but still, work was but still, it bothered me.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!
Welcome to the secret commentary at the end of each chapter. I'm assuming if you are still here, you have either randomly stumbled onto this by listening to this chapter first, or you are what I would call a literary masochist. Anyone following these chapters from scratch, much less listening to these commentaries, would know that, I'll be honest, I hold this novel in contempt. We haven't gotten to what I'm going to call the worst literary experience of my writing career, which is a chapter that's pending, and a couple, which literally took me about 2 years to write. If you consider what I consider my writing career, which was basically the last 20 years, literally two of those were spent on one chapter of this abomination of a novel. My intent to teach writing lessons based on the mistakes I made in this novel are at some point are kind of a diminishing returns. I can certainly make comments repeatedly about how awful it is, and I can honor my past self by making sure that something is done with the novel, but at the end of the day, there's a reason it's not for sale on Kindle, as is. I could hire an editor, but I view the structural problems to be so large that it's basically unsalvageable unless I rewrite the whole thing from scratch. The more I look at this, the more I kind of feel the same way about the sixth novel, which is a shame because the sixth novel is far more interesting to me. It's the only one I've written for National Novel Writing Month. It has much more interesting characters and a much more interesting story structure. But it's definitely the most personal novel I've written. And certain attitudes I had at the time have changed a lot. Certain things I got in feedback the sixth novel is the sixth novel, and we'll get to that, assuming I ever do anything like it for the podcast, which I probably won't. Like I said, I'm heavily inclined to literally rewrite it from scratch. And if I do that, then I would do that much before I rewrite the 3 novels that I'm going to write for this one. In order of priority right now in terms of long-term projects, at the top of the list is a 5-novel series for Inglemia. I think Inglemia, as gonzo and off the charts as it is, has more potential than any of the other projects that I'm discussing. Then there's a series that I'm calling Lasers Against the Dark Lord, which is basically going to be a series of 3 anthologies with novellas and short stories, basically as a sequel. Or rather, I think a better explanation would be The Lord of the Rings to The Hobbit that is Grenade Man vs. the Zombies. Given that Grenade Man vs. the Zombies seems to be the most popular thing I've ever written, more of the crazy, except in fairy tales, seems like a good way to go. But I've already started Inglemia, and I think that even though as gaming fiction, even though I don't intend to sell it as such, there are inherent limits. I mean, yes, it's young adult fiction, but it's just not going to be perceived that way. It's going to be perceived as D&D fiction, and even assuming it gets picked up by large chains, which, I mean, really, seriously, but, it's military fiction, it's fantasy, it's gonzo and over the top. I just don't picture Army of Fire ever taking off. But, I mean, I think that's kind of the point there, folks. I'm writing at this point because I want to, which, given how miserable the process makes me, you'd kind of wonder why I do. I mean, with the completion of the 7th novel, I've completed my life goal, right? I've written 7 novels, at least by the loosest interpretation, which I interpret it, because, again, there's nobody asking for this and nobody making me do this but me. And I think that's one of the secrets to being a writer, right? I may never be a successful writer, but I am one that keeps on going. And the secret to that is that you write for yourself. Right? I mean, writing for your audience is good. It improves the story and the quality of the story that you're writing and makes it more accessible to more people, which is great. But at the end of the day, nobody but you can make you sit down and put words on a piece of paper and then go back and edit it again and again and again and make it presentable. Now, this novel has never gone through the proper editing process, which is hard. I mean, I've had people help me with it. My former mother-in-law and my mother and my stepfather have all helped me edit this thing, so it's not quite as much of an abomination as it could be. But it's got problems. So speaking to the specific chapter, love the fact that Quiescence Prow gets more humiliated. But, this universe does like Quiescence Prow. The universe does seem to like some people better than other people. They just, there are some people who are always at the right place at the right time, who always fall up, who always are able to get away with things that shouldn't. And I wrote a universe where the most obnoxious, deluded part of myself was that person in the universe. And, I'm pretty sure I'm ultimately going to consider this set on Terra. And Terra is exactly the kind of place that would love Quiescence Prow. They would find ways to involve Quiescence Prow in all kinds of things, because Quiescence Prow is a story waiting to happen. Now, whether or not those are good stories, I can't tell you, but Terra, in terms of making the story happen, doesn't care about viewer quality. It just cares about making the story happen. Anyway, my point is that, I got 5 corporations getting together to form a conspiracy. I have vague memories of what the rest of this book is like, but I'll be honest, I'm kind of rereading it and rediscovering it. It's been almost 14 years since I looked at this thing. And, I mean, it's, in terms of quality, I'd probably give this one a B-. It's not chapter 2. And there's no insane scientist in science in it, like the dog that, smells the radiation. It is long. It's way too long. But, it does what it's supposed to do, which is get Prow out of prison and get him involved with the conspiracy and set up the second half of the book, which it does.